It's a city that's hosted all sorts of parties.
But it's never seen anything like this.
We're really excited, and we cannot wait to showcase Milwaukee to the world.
50,000 people are coming to town.
That's a great bump to the economy, obviously.
Those who aren't coming will be watching.
We have a chance to showcase Milwaukee.
History will be made.
We have an opportunity, all of us do, to help Milwaukee to shine.
And we're making sure you're ready.
This is Conventional Wisdom.
Welcome, everyone. We are here to give you the one thing you hadn't asked for, another podcast.
No one has been asking for this, but we're giving it to you anyway, and we have no plans to be doing this for a long time. This is a very limited offer. Steffi and I will be anchoring our coverage of the Republican National Convention this July down at Fiserv Forum, and we are starting our preparation. And we thought we would bring you along as we do that to tell you the things we've learned and what we can expect and how we got here in the first place.
Conventions are very interesting. Just off camera, we have Professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee. We're going to be bringing him in momentarily. In today's episode, though...
You want to check your mic real quick as long as we're...
Mordecai 1098.
That's enough. That's perfect. You don't even need to do the whole thing. That's great.
We will get to you here. Don't let Ted bully you. You know, in today's episode, we've titled it Unconventional because we're learning why conventions came about in the first place. We've brought in, of course, Professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee to talk about the role of conventions today and what we can expect for a really wild week in Milwaukee come July.
But in Mordecai's favorite movie, The Sound of Music, Julie Andrews starts with, let's start at the very beginning and how we even got the convention process. And for that, we go to the Pacific Northwest and a professor there who gets us up to speed.
Dr. Margaret Oma is a professor of history at the University of Washington. She specializes in the growth of tech economy and the history of American politics. And let's combine those two, Professor. They say in corporate America, this is a meeting that could have been accomplished with an email. And I sort of feel that's what modern conventions have become. Here we sit in March with no suspense aside from who Donald Trump's vice president might be in Milwaukee. We'll talk to Dr. Lee about modern conventions in a second. Could you take us back to the beginning? Because there's one president who doesn't have to deal with conventions or nomination process, and that's George Washington. The rest had to.
Yeah, George Washington was the first and the original, and he was really would have despaired at the partisan landscape that we've arrived at now in 2024. I think it wasn't in his vision of what the presidency might be. George Washington famously gave a farewell speech when he left the presidency, warning his fellow politicians and fellow Americans about the dangers of faction, which was the idea of, the tribalism in politics and dividing against each other, which has been read in many ways as a warning against parties themselves. One thing that he was reflecting, though, is from the very beginning, and this is human nature, this is politics everywhere, there has been factionalism. There have been different groups of politicians that have had different ideas about the way the country should go. There have been groups of Americans who have different ideas and, you might say, platforms. And so what evolves over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century is a party system. It takes a really long time to get to the party system that we're familiar with now. But along with that are evolved the conventions, which are not something that were present at the beginning. They are also events that have really changed in what happens there, who's there, who's watching, what the significance is to the election or the nomination itself. And that has changed enormously over time. The conventions of 2024 are really different from the ones of 1924 and on and on and on, going back in time.
But before we even get there, let's talk about Adams and Jefferson and those first few before the first conventions hit. Yeah. If you can, in about a minute or so, sum up how they became the nominees of those parties.
They became the nominees from a much more closed, and we might think of it a non-democratic process.
Sure.
Where their fellow where their peers, the other legislators, other members of the legislature of Congress, and in the case of Washington, leaders of the Constitutional Convention, were choosing them as their leaders. And it was a matter of, it was not something that was put forth to a broad vote. This is also at a time when the elections themselves, the only people voting in elections up until about the third decade of the 19th century, were white men who owned property. And that was a very small percentage of the whole American public, much less the electorate. So keep in mind, it's a very small number of people who are choosing who the president are, even the nominees for the presidency.
Could you have called these caucuses? I've seen them referred to as sort of caucuses in a way that we don't think of caucuses now necessarily.
Yeah. So even after, the election of 1800, which Thomas Jefferson famously referred to as the Revolution of 1800, was really the first contested election or sort of partisan election where there was Jefferson v. Adams. It was a hot mess. It went on for months and months and months. It was so complicated that there was actually a constitutional amendment that came out of that, changing the way in which a president was elected and the way electoral votes were counted. But in the matter of choosing the president from there, through the early 19th century, yes, these caucus meetings start to emerge, which are essentially local and district and state meetings of a party or a faction. And also keep in mind that this was not the two-party system, wasn't the parties we know today. There was the Federalists, a short-lived party that went away quite quickly. Both Washington and Adams were identified as Federalists. There were just to be really confusing, the Democrat Republicans, sometimes called the Republicans, didn't have anything in common with either the Democrats or the Republican parties that emerged later in the century. There were the Whigs. There were other parties that are long lost to history, like the Anti-Mason Party, which in fact was the very first party to hold a national convention in 1832. Spoiler alert, they didn't win anything, but they get the title of having held the first national party nominating convention.
And that is at the earliest form, the embryo of modern day conventions per se. Hamilton, the musical, did a pretty good job of getting us up to 1830, right? And so, now we get to this, what you called it, the Whig Party, the Anti-Mason Party.
Well, yeah, the Anti-Mason Party was one of many smaller, short-lived parties that flare up. The Whig Party was slightly longer in duration. It was a major political force in the early part of the 19th century. The 1840s and 1850s, the run-up to the Civil War, is really a time, kind of a political bloodbath when it comes to parties. There are so many different parties that are rising up around certain issues, whether it be immigration or the biggest issue of all, slavery and the extension of the slavery into the West. Of course, the Republican Party is born out of this moment, born in the 1850s, and its very first nominee, his first winning nominee in 1860 was Abraham Lincoln, who incidentally did not attend the convention. In the custom of the day throughout the 19th century, the candidates themselves didn't show up and dirty their fingers by actually attending the convention and politicking for themselves. Lincoln found out he was a Republican nominee by a telegraph. He got long distance message. That's how he found out.
Was he in Springfield at the time and he received a telegram?
I believe he was. Yeah.
And let's talk about, because that's fascinating, because we cannot envision now a candidate not showing up at the convention. They build up into their big night, the VP the night before and then them. It was considered poor manners, almost gauche to show up.
Oh, yes. It was unseemly to campaign, period.
Mm-hmm.
You had other people campaign for you. Up through the early 20th century, the nominees of the major parties would sit at home and let other people do the work for them. And it was only with at the turn of the 20th century, with moments that were extremely effective, like future President William McKinley gives speeches from his front porch in Canton, Ohio. His front porch campaign had it, but he still didn't leave home, to be clear. But he was, now the media had changed so that reporters could come to him, get on the train, come visit him at his home, hear his speech, take notes, and then by wire services would send the news all over the country. So the conventions were not something that the candidates showed up to make their case until the 20th century.
You made the point that conventions used to be where they got stuff done. There was suspense. There was real suspense. Franklin Pierce not nominated until 49 ballots had been cast.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to talk about suspense. There was real suspense back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a shame that, that conventions get so much TV time and so much attention and such a platform now when often nothing really happens there. There's not a lot of drama, because back in the day, man, if that had been a televised event, that Franklin Pierce convention would have been must-see TV. Can you imagine? Or even on the radio.
We would have gone on very late that night. This was like
yes.
a 28-inning ball game that keeps us up until 3 in the morning.
It would have not been, much sleep would have been lost. It would have not been great.
I love people who do show up and with a little confidence. Roscoe Conkling in 1876, so confident he was going to get the nomination, he came up with Conkling and Hayes, it's the ticket that pays. Well, it paid for Hayes. He became the nominee, Rutherford Hayes, and Conkling went back to New York State where he was a boss.
Yeah. And these, the other thing, sometimes I even joke to my students that I sometimes have to refer to my notes to remember the order of all the 19th century presidents, because there are a lot of one-term presidents and a lot of people that aren't quite as, there are a few iconic presidents like Lincoln, of course, but unlike the 20th century, where it's very easy to recall, who was president and in what order, because they're these outsized figures. They're famous. They're so important. I think the nominating process is one window into why we have presidents that it's hard to remember exactly who was president when, because the president and the candidate wasn't as important in the whole system as now. First of all, the presidency was a much smaller job. The U.S. was not the superpower militarily and industrially it later became. It was the government was not as large. So the president wasn't in charge of as large an executive branch, and the parties were the most important thing. So you have someone like Roscoe Conkling or Rutherford Hayes, a boss in New York, who are able to come in, and all they have to do is get the support of their parties, and they're representing their party. It matters less who the person is, and in this case, it's always been a man, who the man is, and more what party they are representing, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And those two parties are the two dominant parties from the Civil War forward.
Let's get a little more modern, and it's a Wisconsinite, the governor, Bob LaFollette, fighting Bob LaFollette, who says, you know what? Voters ought to have more of a say. So Wisconsin, the home state of fighting Bob, in 1904, we start the process of primaries, do we not?
That is correct. This real push at the turn of the 20th century to make the nominating process more democratic. Ironically, even though conventions and caucuses in these early 19th century meetings were designed to open up the process beyond the elite landholding men that had been in charge of it up until then. By the time you get to the late 19th century, the U.S. is much bigger. The voting population is much bigger. There's a large voter base. You no longer have to be a property owning white man. You have to be a man in most places, but there are many states where women have the franchise even before the 19th Amendment. And so the conventions themselves are seen as these very close processes. You have these party bosses who are nominating these people that no one's heard of, and the voters themselves don't really get a say in that. So Bob LaFollette, other progressive politicians, and this is progressive in the old early 20th century sense, but again, trying to shake up the system and make it more open and allow the ordinary voter to have a say in who the nominee is for the general election of their party.
I have two more questions. If we have not had, since 1952, is the last time a nominee had to go to the second or third ballot, right? Mm-hmm. Is this the best way to be doing it?
It's the grass is always greener when it comes to political conventions. That's to be sure. I mean, we can, look back to some of these epic conventions. Even the convention that nominated Franklin Roosevelt, they had 10 hours of nominating speeches and 4 votes before they got to Roosevelt, and he did not come in as the obvious favorite. The first vote, by the way, speaking of losing sleep, happened at 4:32 a.m. And so we
would let our morning show handle that.
It was a morning show.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The morning show would have done that. It was a real, these real epic events. And it still was primaries were in existence throughout much of the 20th century, and in more and more states. Wisconsin led the way, but others again and again, were bringing up, and it was, as primaries proliferated, it became, good form for the nominating convention to follow the will of the primary voters, but they were not binding. So, even up until the 1960s, you have primaries that one candidate might have won that actually by the time you get to the convention, the party just doesn't, the delegates switch sides, and there's a lot of flexibility and kind of moving to another candidate by the time you get to the summer's convention. So it's really only from the 70s forward that there is more of a, the will of the voters is really directing what happens at the convention. As a consequence, the convention is not the place where the nomination itself is decided, that it no longer makes news. So in some ways, the fact that it isn't a newsworthy event, it's more just a big beauty pageant for the party, so to speak, or big television event, that is reflecting the fact that voters are indeed having a say early on in the nominating process. And we would say, I think generally, since the whole purpose has been, pushing towards more democracy, lot less, that probably is a good thing.
Final question. As a historian, which convention, Democratic or Republican, would you have loved to have been at?
Oh, gosh. Well, the ones that were the most interesting are the ones that are, the hot mess, right? So the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago might have been one where there was, protesters and police fighting in the streets and Democrats fighting on the floor. I don't know if actually I'd want to be there. It would have been interesting. I would have actually been really interested to be at that 1932 convention, also in Chicago, that nominated Franklin Roosevelt. And I also, that earlier that summer, would have liked to have been at the same place, the same Chicago Coliseum in 1932 at the Republican convention that nominated Herbert Hoover. The two venues had this. It was the same organist who played the music in between the different, to when there was blank space to be filled. And the organist at both events played "Happy Days Are Here Again." Remember, this is 1932. It's the depths of the Great Depression. That was interpreted when it was played on the radio as kind of a, during the Hoover nomination is like, oh my gosh, how ironic. Happy Days ain't here, and Hoover, you got to get out of here. And when Roosevelt was nominated, that became the campaign's theme song. He just took that up and said, "Happy Days are here again if you vote for me." And Roosevelt won in a landslide.
I love it. Dr. Margaret Oma of the University of Washington. You've written 2 books. You've written a number of books, but The Code is your most recent. Pivotal Tuesdays, for those of us who are election junkies, I'm going to get that out of a local library. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. It's a fascinating discussion on a topic that a lot of people might think is boring, but you brought it alive for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
So we talked about the very early days of conventions, how they came about, the progression through them. Presidential primaries, they didn't really exist until the 20th century, and they did not have a major impact on conventions until many years later. Bring us up to speed, Professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee. 1960s, I know that's kind of a sweet spot. I know things really kind of started changing and their role in our political process.
They totally changed because more and more states started having primaries. So if you have more primaries, you have predictable votes in the convention, which means that the backroom deals aren't quite as flexible or quite as open. In fact, primaries so revolutionized American politics that the last time that we've had a contested convention, where going into the convention, we didn't know for sure who was going to get the nomination. That was 1960. That was John F. Kennedy going to Los Angeles. There were other candidates. There was Lyndon Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader. Stuart Symington was a senator. Adlai Stevenson was in the wings. And so...
2-time loser, Adlai Stevenson, right? 52 and 56. Right. He was going to be a backup to a backup to a backup, right?
Yeah. And then Eugene McCarthy, who later became the opponent of the war, gave this speech about don't turn your back on the man who has led us. And apparently it was a really good speech. So going into the convention, the Kennedy people knew they were ahead, but they didn't have enough votes for sure to have a majority, for sure to get the nomination. And they did this thing. Ted Kennedy at the time was this kid, he was in his 20s. They assigned him to the Wyoming delegation. Why Wyoming? Because it's the last state that would be called in the roll call. And Wyoming was split. Part of it was for Kennedy. Part of the delegates were for Lyndon Johnson. Ted Kennedy said to the chair of the convention, if when we get to Wyoming, if you could put my brother over the top by casting a unanimous vote for my brother, will you do it? And the head of the delegation said, yeah, sure. He knew this would never happen. This is like a 1 in a million.
He figured it'd already be decided by the time it got to them,
It would
right?
either be decided or for sure there'd be another roll call. And so he gives it away. He said, sure, I'll do it. They get to Wyoming, and Wyoming has enough delegates to put him over the top, and he keeps his word. He casts all the delegates' votes for John F. Kennedy, and that's how he got the nomination. And so since then, there has never been a moment like that.
And no excitement.
No excitement. Yeah.
What has been the drama since then, 1960? Who the running mate might be? Sometimes they have been introduced there, but that's not even the case anymore. By the time we got to conventions in the last several years, we've known the ticket.
When Professor O'Mara said, was asked by you, which convention would you have wanted to be at? And she said, I would want to be in 1968. And that's a really good call, because even though Hubert Humphrey had the delegates locked up, that it was such a moment in the opposition to the war in Vietnam and then what happened on the streets, that I think she's right. It would have been just a moment that would make your heart stop just to be there.
Well, we've got 50,000 people coming to Milwaukee from across the United States and some territories. So what's the point? Why are we still doing it this way? We're happy to have the visitors. Absolutely. It's going to be a fascinating thing to cover. How has the convention changed? What is the role then of the modern convention? Because there's been no suspense since 1960.
Speaking from a dry analytical point of view, there should no longer be conventions, because we know who would have the votes to be the nominee. So you don't need a convention. So in part, it's the tradition. In part, it's getting free television coverage because they're introducing the candidate to the nation.
But in fairness, a lot less television coverage.
Less. I think what happened in Milwaukee for the DNC is an example of almost a modern day convention. It was just a TV show, really. It might have been live, but there wasn't much going on. So in one respect, it's PR. The only other justification would be that a party has to be cohesive. There has to be a sense of we're sort of all in this together. And I think by going to a convention, the party activists from the 50 states, they feel good about, here are all these other people who think like me, who feel like me. I want to talk to them. I want to get to know them. I want to know what are they doing in their state that maybe I should do in my state. So there's a little bit of party building going on, but it's pretty minor.
It seems like choreographed pageantry, really. I mean, at this day and age.
The Nixon 1968 convention, which was in Miami, was the first convention that had a TV script. And they got it down to the second. And ever since then, it's been very controlled. And we've rarely seen anything go off script. There was that time that Clint Eastwood wanted to debate. Who did he want to debate?
Well, it was an empty chair.
Well, he debated an empty chair. That wasn't planned. George McGovern.
Well, he wanted to debate Obama.
Right.
And the empty chair was taking the place of Obama, which is probably the best hour on what was then known as Twitter that I can ever remember. Twitter exploded as there's this famous actor and conservative, politician in his own right, a former mayor of Carmel, California, talking to an empty chair.
Right. But he didn't get it cleared in advance. It wasn't on the plan. So other than those sort of spontaneous, unpredictable moments, it is exactly the way you described it.
I think for a lot of people at home, we see little snippets on TV. We see the speeches because those are usually the things that are highlighted in prime time and whatnot. But for those, Fiserv Forum is going to be the home of the convention. Yes, there's going to be other places that are having their little parties and gatherings after the fact. But for those at home or those who are listening right now, what actually happens inside? Who is inside? And what is the day filled with?
Beats me. No, they have a plan. The first day is this and the second day is that. Then the ending of the convention is when the nominee gives his acceptance speech, and that's the sort of high-powered moment. There's sometimes business to do, but I think one of the interesting things that'll be lacking in Milwaukee is that President Trump created a wrinkle in the tradition. The wrinkle was that all conventions started with a fight over the platform. what is the platform of our party? Not that it obligated anybody. Nobody got kicked out of the party for going against the platform. But having platform fights told you what the party stood for or what it didn't stand for. When President Trump ran for re-election 4 years ago, he had this innovation. He said, I don't want a platform. People know what I stand for. People know my record. We don't need a platform. And that sort of created this different kind of moment. And I'm pretty sure Milwaukee will be similar in the sense that there won't be any platform fights.
Well, you bring up a good point, because that's when, I mean, whether you're talking about the Vietnam War or reproductive rights, there have been those daytime meetings and debates about discussions about what our where is our party, whether it's Democratic or Republican, where are we on this issue? That's now gone. And it was gone, as you point out, 4 years ago. The party platform is what Donald Trump says it is.
It's gone, and also what are gone are credential fights. I don't know if you remember, 1964, Lyndon Johnson is cruising to get renominated or nominated for a full term. And there were two delegations from, I think it was Mississippi. One was the white Mississippi Democratic Party, and one was the integrated Mississippi Party. And they both sought to be recognized. And traditionally, historically, the white delegation would have been seated. But Lyndon Johnson engineered a compromise that they both got seated in a kind of a compromise.
Do you think conventions, I know that we're getting close to probably being close to the end of our time here, but do you think conventions actually do anything to mobilize voters? I mean, it's in July, the election's in November. There's still a big swath of time where people can change their mind. They might lean a different direction. They might be put off by something. Do you think that conventions have any role in that anymore?
I think there can be a moment in the convention, probably on the last night, where the nominee says to America, this is what I stand for. And if they can come up with a soundbite, whatever that soundbite might be, that might leave an indelible impression on the public at large. And that's the moment where the convention really can have some high impact. I think it was Biden's line was it restoring the soul of America or something like that? That was a pretty good line. I'm not sure that he won the election because of it, but that's a moment that can be very effective.
Having said that, and having said the need that, you know, as I said at the beginning of my talk with Professor O'Meara, this is a meeting that could have been handled with an email. It's still going to make news, and it's still going to be the starting campaign for the Trump candidacy, and a short time later, the next month, for the Biden candidacy. It's still going to be a news-making event, is it not?
I think so, because the people they pick to talk are the future stars of the party. So who will they pick? Who are the ones who are going to be running for president 4 years after that? Now, I don't want to start talking about the 20.
We will ask you to leave if you start talking about the 2028 campaign.
Our brains can't even handle it at this point.
We're trying to take baby steps up until July.
But to see what's the young blood of this party and what's the young blood of the Democratic Party, who are the future leaders, I think that's a really positive thing to look for.
But it'll be interesting to see who's allowed to speak as well. At this point, will Nikki Haley be allowed to speak? She was the last one in there, very critical of Donald Trump, saying he cannot win. I can beat Joe Biden. Will he be magnanimous and give her a spot on the floor to say this tent? Republicans like to say we have a very big tent, bigger than people think. But if certain factions are kept from the microphone, that's also telling.
Well, I don't think Trump would particularly want to say forgive her. He's not a forgiving kind of guy. But on the other hand, 8 years ago in the convention that we knew he was going to get nominated, Ted Cruz still got a podium spot. And Ted Cruz gave a searing speech criticizing Trump. So sometimes unpredictable things do happen.
Which I guess is the excitement that we can all hope for, because a lot of the other excitement of knowing who's going to be nominated has long gone. You know, as we wrap things up here, Professor Lee, do you think at some point conventions are ever just going to evolve to the point of fading away?
I think so, because they originated, based on Professor O'Meara, there was a need for it. There was a need for it in 1960 because so few states had primaries. Now, practically every delegate is elected or selected in some kind of a democratic process. I don't think we need conventions anymore. I do think they'll fade away.
What are you most looking forward to when July rolls around, those 4 days? What are you going to be keeping an eye on? What are you most curious about?
Will there be a platform? I don't think so. Will he announce his VP candidate then or before? If he announces it during the convention, I'm looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to his acceptance speech. What will the tone be? Who does he appeal to in America?
Will anything be different than it was a few years ago? We shall see. We're in this together, people. We're in this together. That's why we're doing this, because we're learning so much as you at home are learning it along with us.
And I just want to point out, if there's an issue you're interested leading into it, ted.perry@fox.com, stephanie.grady@fox.com. We're kind of learning all this together. So if there's a segment you'd like to see us cover on this podcast, by all means, shoot us a line.
July 15th through the 18th, that's when the Republican National Convention is going to be here in Milwaukee. 50,000 people. Businesses are very happy about it because obviously they're hoping to reap some sort of financial gain from all of this. You at home, your gain is for you to decide.
This is the inaugural Conventional Wisdom, but there will be more. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.